We're going to continue this morning where we left off in the book of Genesis, if you'd like to turn there. Genesis chapter 12. We covered a pretty important passage last week, and that was verses 1 through 3 of chapter 12. And this is what some people would call where God kicks off the Jewish nation with Abraham, and he gives Abraham these promises. Of all the people on earth, God selects one guy, Abraham, to be his select, chosen person, and he gives Abraham this covenant. Chapter 12, verse 1, the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land I'll show you. I'll make of you a great nation, so that I'll bless you and make your name great, so that you'll be a blessing. I'll bless those that bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed." And God gives him this covenant, and we said it is an unconditional covenant because there's no word if in there. Abraham, if you obey, if you follow my commands, if you go where I tell you to go, if you do this or that or the other thing, then I will make you into a great nation. There is none of that. It's a totally unconditional promise. This comes into play many times throughout Genesis, throughout the scriptures, even throughout all of human history. As we look at Israel now, we see they are not a super godly nation at this point, you may have noticed. So does God still keep his covenant with Israel? Yes, he does. Why? Because there is nothing that Abraham or Isaac or Jacob or anybody else could do to nullify this covenant. God said, I will do this no matter what. And it takes him about half a chapter to really put that to the test, doesn't it? Because in verse 10, we get to a story where Abraham goes down to Egypt. There's a famine. He gets down there and says, wow, Sarah's really gorgeous. They're going to kill me so they can have her. And he says, Sarah, here's what I want you to do. Tell everybody that you're my sister, which is halfway true, is a half-sister. Tell them you're my sister so that they will leave me alone, and they'll probably take you, but, it's a small price to pay for not being killed. That's okay. And so he gets down there, and sure enough, they say, wow, she's really gorgeous. We ought to tell Pharaoh about this. So they go tell Pharaoh. Pharaoh comes, and he says, wow, you're right. I think I will take her for myself and add her to my collection. And they do that. And God comes in. I mean, we laugh, but it's pretty much how it happened. And so Sarah is now with Pharaoh. Sarah becomes Mrs. Pharaoh instead of Mrs. Abraham. And this is a problem on multiple levels. I can only imagine the conversation after the story was over, how that goes at home. But God comes in and just starts pounding on Pharaoh. We don't know exactly what God did to Pharaoh, but something he did so that Pharaoh knows immediately, I am under judgment for something in some way. I don't know if God gave him dreams or sickness or all those things. Who knows? But God comes in and just starts punishing Pharaoh in some way. And Pharaoh kind of comes around and says, whoa, I did something wrong here. Verse 17, the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house great plagues because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. So Pharaoh called on Abraham and said, what have you done to me? Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why'd you say she's my sister? So I took her for my wife. Here's your wife. Take her, go. And Pharaoh gave men orders concerning him. They sent him away with all the stuff that he'd already given her and said, just get out of here. It almost sounds reminiscent of when the Israelites walk out of Egypt many centuries later, where Pharaoh just says, you guys are too much trouble and more than you're worth. Take a whole bunch of stuff. Just get out of here. Just go before God destroys us all. And so they leave. And while that's fascinating on both historical and moral level, you're right, don't try to give away your wife is probably a good rule to live by. Even more importantly, I think, is what? The level where we say God's covenant is in serious jeopardy if he gives away his wife. Because God promised Abraham what? To give him the land, which you probably need more than one guy to capture a land. Promised him to turn into a nation, which requires some offspring. And that the ultimate seed would come through him, which also requires some offspring. And we said the real problem with this story is that if you have no wife, you have no offspring, you have no seed. Again, God's covenant is in jeopardy. Now, last time God's covenant was in jeopardy, he did what? He wiped out the entire planet. He said, I will not do that again. So after the flood, he designates one specific line that he will carry his covenant through. Now that line starts with Abraham. And so instead of wiping out the whole world, he only has to deal with and protect one family. And that's exactly what he did. So it becomes God versus Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Who's going to win? As always, God wins. And so Abram and Sarah are reunited. They go off in marital bliss to discuss how Abraham just tried to sell her at a garage sale, and off they go, but they are still together, and God has preserved his promise. And so, again, it took us only half a chapter to realize just how very unconditional God's covenant was, because it took him about 9 verses to try to do the one thing that's the quickest way to nullify God's covenant, and that's to give away your wife. And God said, nope, I'm sticking you back together because this is important. My covenant is on the line, and I will keep it. And that's where we ended last week. Everybody okay? Continuing on. Chapter 13, I'm not going to read through. If you're reading through on your own, fine. If not, go ahead and read it on your own, because I will not, but I'll summarize it for you. This is where Abraham and Lot, both of them are traveling together. They both become fairly wealthy. Their flocks and herds, which is how they, their source of wealth back then, became too great to live all in one area. They kept eating each other's grass. Their cows keep pushing each other away at the feed trough. It's getting too crowded. And so they said, why don't we split ways and all live in one spot and you live in another spot so that we can have more grass to eat and spread out a little bit. Abraham says, Lot, why don't you pick whichever one you want? And Lot goes out and he stands on a rock and he looks this way and it's a little dry and dusty, and he looks that way and it's all green and lush and wet and watery and stuff. He says, I'll take the wet, watery grass. Thank you very much. My flocks will do great over there. Off I go. And it just so happened that Sodom and Gomorrah are down in that area as well. But he said, yeah, whatever. I'll take the grass. And Abraham says, okay, I'll go that way and we'll both be all right. And so they moved and they split apart. Follow that with chapter 14, where it kind of shifts focus a little bit, and there is a war. Of course, back then you had the whole bunch of little, city-state towns, and this town would attack that town, and every little town had its, we'd probably call it a mayor today, but with more power, they called it a king, whatever. And so a group of towns over here got together and attacked a group of towns over here, and there was a battle back and forth. Lot is captured. And so this is a super fun story. Again, God is clearly protecting Abram. But Abraham gets together his own little personal SWAT team. And this is, I can only imagine this in my mind. My cartoon mind kind of kicks in at this point. Here's five powerful kings over here and 4 powerful kings over there, and the one captures the other, and they're hauling back the bounty. And in comes Rambo Abram with a little handkerchief tied around his head and waving his sword and his band of merry men behind him. And they run in, and I don't know how the battle took place. I don't know what tactics they used. I don't know any of that stuff. But in the end, when the dust, picture in your mind, here's, how the cartoons, they have the 2 sides come together and they start fighting, and you just see poofs of dust all over the place, and then the dust settles, and then whoever wins walks away, and the other guy is kind of going, Okay, that's exactly how this happened. Abram runs in with his band of hitmen, and there's dust clouds flying up, and everybody's fighting, and you see pow, biff, smack, bang. And the dust settles, and the evil kings are sitting there going, and Abram walks away with all the stuff and all the people, and he wins. He wins, and he walks away victorious. But the interesting part of the story is starting in verse 17. After his return from the defeat of that guy and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him. Now, the king of Sodom was one who was attacked. Abraham brought back that town's stuff as well. Everything that the bad guys took as their bounty, as their spoil of war, Abraham took back, and he kind of gave it back to all the people. And among those is the king of Sodom. So the king of Sodom went out to meet him in the valley of Shaveh, that is the king's valley. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. People have different views of exactly who Melchizedek is. Was he an actual guy who was an actual physical king of an actual physical town? Or was he a pre-incarnate Christ? I'm not going to get into that this morning. We just don't have time, and I don't want another bunny trail to follow. Whoever he is, my personal opinion is he's an actual king of an actual place. That's my view. I won't argue either way. But here he comes, Melchizedek, king of Salem. Salem is a place that later would become known as Jerusalem. Okay? Jerusalem. And so he comes down from this town of Jerusalem, and he is the king of this place. And he brings out bread and wine and offering. And he was also a priest of God Most High. Again, just a side note here, not the main point of the story, but I often picture Abraham at this time as being the one and only guy that God is speaking to at this time and working through. And while Abraham is the chosen guy who gets the covenant, apparently God does have other people on earth that, if he is an actual physical regular person, that he is working through. But this guy is priest of God Most High. If you believe he's pre-incarnate Christ, that obviously makes sense because he is that. And if it's just a guy, it's fascinating because somehow God is speaking to and working through this guy as well. But moving on, he's king and priest. And he blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." And Abram gave him 1/10 of everything. Abram, the guy who God has given the covenant to, God's chosen man on earth, he pays homage to, or he pays respect to Melchizedek, this king who is priest of God Most High. And it's a fascinating picture. This little Melchizedek, he's very sure just this one little blip of a story here in Genesis, and he doesn't ever show up again in Scripture until, I think he's mentioned once in Psalm maybe, and then again in the book of Hebrews, in the New Testament, where the writer of Hebrews uses this guy as an illustration of who Christ is, which is probably where some people get the idea that he may have been him. And again, maybe he was. I'm not going to argue one way or the other. But this one little obscure guy, priest and king, servant of God Most High, and he comes out and he blesses Abram, and Abraham says, "I will pay honor to you by giving you a tithe, a 10% offering of everything I have collected, and I will submit and honor you in this way." So the idea is that the way that the money flows is the same way that the honor flows. If I give you money, I'm also giving you honor. If you give me money, I'm also giving you that honor. If you give me money, then you're giving me the honor as well. The honor follows the money. But that's only half the story. Abraham gives him 1/10 of everything. Then we get down to verse 21. But the king of Sodom said to Abram, "Give me the persons, but you take the goods for yourself. I offer you all of these goods and all the stuff that used to be mine that was captured. I will offer that to you as a thanks for going back and being Rambo and getting back my people. Thank you so much for doing that. I will pay for your services by giving you all the stuff." Again, the flow of monetary possessions. But look how he handles this. Abram doesn't say, "Yes, thank you very much. I'll put that in my back pocket and we'll be on our way." He says, "But Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted my hand to the Lord God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I would not take a thread or a sandal strap or anything that is yours, lest you should say, I have made Abram rich. I will take nothing but what the young men have eaten and the share of the men who went with me. Let the other guys, the other kings that went with me, let them take their share. They can have their stuff, but I have sworn I will not take anything from you." So while Abram gives Melchizedek 10%, he's willing to receive from the king of Sodom a solid what? 0%. Why would that be? Or what is he trying to say here? Again, I think he explains it fairly well in this little speech that he made. He says, "I am relying on God to make me who I am. And if I take your stuff, then you have a claim to say, I had a part in making Abram rich and powerful and wealthy." Why does Abram think he will be rich, powerful, and wealthy? Because God had given him a covenant. But if the king of Sodom takes credit for that, who gets less credit for all of that? God himself. Yeah. So he says, I want God to take full credit of who I am and who I will become. I don't want anybody giving you credit for God's work. And probably, I'm guessing, I'm kind of reading between the lines here, my own opinion, Sodom had a certain reputation at that time. We see that in another couple chapters where God comes down and blasts them. But I think Abram is saying, I don't want God's work in my life and God's blessing I don't want you, this wicked, horrible city, to take credit for what God is doing in my life. I want that to be clear. Everything I have will be attributed to God, and I don't want to take your stuff. And so Abraham, in this little monetary exchange, he gives honor to the priest of God by giving 10%, but he refuses any kind of honor or association or indebtedness to the king of Sodom, who is clearly not on God's side, for his successes. That makes sense? And I think that speaks volumes in terms of Abram's faith in God and his reliance upon him, and the way he takes the covenant very, very seriously. And in fact, God comes and kind of comments on this in a sense in chapter 15. Chapter 15, verse 1 says, "After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. He said, 'Fear not, Abram, I am your shield.'" Shield is a defense, your defender, your protector. "Your reward shall be very great." Abram just got back from a battle where he no doubtly needed a shield, and he just walked out of a situation where he was offered his own version of reward. And I think I can see how chapter 15 comes directly from the end of chapter 14, where in battle, Abraham had to use physical shields, of course, but obviously God was protecting him, and his reward in chapter 14 was almost in a temptation type of way coming from Sodom. Abraham said, "Nope," and so God shows up and says, "Yes, good choice, I will be your reward. Fear not, I am your shield, your reward for me will be very great." But Abram said, "O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue to be childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus." He says, all this is fine and good and dandy, but to make this covenant thing work, I'm going to need an offspring. I'm getting up there. I'm on Social Security right now. I don't have a whole lot of time left. We got to start working something out. Verse 3, Abraham said, "Behold, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir." Behold, the word of the Lord came to him and said, "This man, your servant guy, shall not be your heir. Your very own son shall be your heir." And he brought him outside and said, "Look towards heaven, number the stars if you can, if you're able to." Then he said to him, "So shall your offspring be." And he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. Does that verse sound familiar to anybody? It should, because it shows up again in the New Testament in the book of Hebrews, and I think Romans also quotes it. Yeah, Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him for righteousness. I think that's Romans 4. Somebody correct me later if I'm wrong, but not right now. But yes, Abraham believed God was counted to him for righteousness. It was that faith that God counted for righteousness. Before Moses' law ever came about, it'll be 500 years until Moses' law comes along. But here's Abraham getting righteousness before God because of the faith that he had in his covenant. And so we see that this chapter 15, again, he's reinforcing the covenant that he had before. So the covenant that started in chapter 3, verse 15 with the seed, and then God built upon that and refined it in chapter 3, verses 12, verses 1 through 3. Now we see him reinforcing and supporting it even more in chapter 15. And it's a cumulative covenant. He keeps refining and reinforcing and promising and elaborating on this covenant that he's given him. And again, God said, "I will do all these things for you. I'll give you all the offspring. You will have a son." And again, we see the lack of the word if. Yeah, there is no if. It is still unconditional promise. Verse 7, he said to him, "I am the Lord who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess." But he said, "Oh Lord, how am I to know that I shall possess it? I'm just one little guy." Verse 9, so he said to him, "Here's how. Bring me a heifer that's 3 years old, a female goat that's 3 years old, a ram that's also 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon." Abraham says, that's a weird grocery list, but okay, whatever. So he brings them the things. Verse 10, he cut them in half, and he laid each half over against the other. But he did not cut the birds in half. And when the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, Abraham drove them away. And as the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abraham. And behold, a dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. Then the Lord said to Abraham, "Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and that they will be afflicted for 400 years. That land that he's talking about is the land of Egypt, for 400 years. Verse 14, "But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve," and boy did he, "and afterward they will come out with great possession. And as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace, and you'll be buried at a good old age. And they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete." What in the world is going on here? Why did God ask for all these animals, and what's the story? Well, again, this is a form of covenant apparently back then, where you take the animals, slice them in half goes over here and half goes over there, and the two people of the covenant would go walking through the center. The idea is that if one of us breaks the covenant, may you end up like those animals that we're walking through the midst of, kind of stepping on their guts as we go, maybe. but may the breaker of the covenant end up like these animals are. In fact, we see that referenced actually back in Jeremiah chapter 34. Turn there if you want, but you don't have to. I'll read it to you quickly. Verse 17, clear back in the book of Jeremiah, says, "Therefore, thus says the Lord, you have not obeyed me by proclaiming liberty, everyone to his brother, to his neighbor. Behold, I proclaim to you liberty to the sword, to pestilence and famine, declares the Lord. You've not obeyed me, you've not kept my covenant. I will make you a whore to all the kingdoms of the earth, and the men who transgressed my covenant and did not keep the terms of the covenant that they made before me, I will make them like the calf that they cut in two and passed between its parts." Sound familiar? Yes, same type of covenant. "The officials in Judah and all the officials of Jerusalem, eunuchs and all the people who passed between the parts of the calf. And I will give them into the hands of their enemies and into the hand of those who seek their lives. Their dead bodies shall be food for the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth." So we see the same type of covenant in Jeremiah, and God says the same thing. He says, you guys have broken my covenant. This would be Moses' law in this case. And he said, so be it. May you be just like the parts of the calves that we cut in half and walked between. So that's the idea of the covenant. The only trick here is that in verse 12 it says, Abraham fell down into a deep sleep. And the only person walking down between these, verse 17, when the sun had gone down, it was dark, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, to your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, and all the lands of these people here listed. So Abraham's asleep, what does it say? A smoking firepot and flaming torch, symbolic of God himself, to save time here, walks down through the pieces. Now again, let's picture in our minds what's going on here. Picture what the covenant means. The two people of the covenant walk between, and they each look at each other and say, if you break the covenant, you're going to be like that animal. And the other person says, if you break the covenant, you're going to be like the animal. But Abraham's passed out asleep over in the corner. The only one walking through the pieces is who? That would be God himself. Why would only one person, if the covenant is between two people, why is only one person walking through the halves? Because God has his obligation to fulfill in this unconditional covenant. What about Abraham? What are the terms of his covenant? He has no liability in it whatsoever, does he? In that sense, he's not part of that covenant. He doesn't have the responsibility. God says, I will do this for you, period. It's a one-sided, unconditional covenant. And he's reinforcing that here in this story. Completely unconditional. And again, aren't we glad that it is? Because the Israelites messed it up countless times. If it was conditional, they'd have been out of God's covenant a long time ago. But it is completely unconditional covenant. Well, that brings us to chapter 16. All right, yeah, we'll read it. It's important. It says this. Now Sarai, Abraham's wife, had borne him no children. We're aware of this. This is a problem to the covenant. But she had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abraham, Abraham, I have a brilliant idea. I just know what to do. She said, behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. So why don't you go into my servant? It may be that I shall obtain children by her. I have a eligible young servant girl, lady, and maybe if you would marry her and produce some offspring, it'll be your kid as well. God can fulfill the covenant through her child. Clearly, this is what God has in mind because he has provided the means and the opportunity. Everything's right here. Obviously, this is how God intends to fulfill his covenant. Yes? Well, Abraham listened to the voice of Sarai. Another fine move. Yes. Verse 3. So, Abraham lived 10 years in the land. After he had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abraham's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abraham, her husband, as a wife. Okay, Abram says. So he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she'd conceived, she looked in contempt on her mistress. Again, back in that day, being childless was a disgrace and an embarrassment. And so now, Mama Sarai gave Hagar to her husband. Husband and Hagar have a baby. Now what's the position of Sarai and Hagar? It's almost like Hagar the servant says, I'm one up on you now. because I have your husband's kid, and you don't have a kid. I can offer him something that you cannot. And whether this was all in Sarai's mind or whether Hagar was actually doing this, it's kind of hard to say from the story. I don't know. But Sarai said to Abraham, may the wrong done to me be on you. This is all your fault, Abraham. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me. How dare you do this, Abram? This is all your fault. She was a real keeper, wasn't she? I've joked before, maybe there's reasons why Abram keeps trying to give her away. I'm not sure. Maybe it's more than just he fears for his life. Maybe he says, I'd rather face Pharaoh than deal with you anymore. I'm not sure. But she seems to be kind of a crabby lady. Very attractive, super hot, but not the best personality maybe. I'm not sure. But she says, Abram, this is all your fault. Why'd you go in and sleep with the girl that I gave you? Well, because you told me to. Well, may God judge between you and me. It's all your fault. Verse 6, but Abraham said to Sarai, behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please. She's your servant. You do whatever you want. What does this have to do with me? And that answer disturbs me a little bit too. It's a little uneasy with me, but that's what he said. And so Sarai dealt harshly with her, this pregnant servant girl who Sarai gave to Abraham for that purpose. And now it happened. She got everything she wanted, and she starts, and I don't know what dealt harshly with her means. The Bible doesn't elaborate. Did she just yell at her? Did she make her work overtime? Did she start beating her, this poor pregnant girl? I don't know, but it's a pretty gritty situation. So much so that Hagar runs away and says, I can't take this kind of abuse anymore. I'm carrying, I'm expecting, and I can't, this is not a workable situation. I have to run away. Verse 7, the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? She said, I'm fleeing from my mistress, Sarai. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her. The angel of the Lord also said to her, I will surely multiply your offspring, so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, for the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man. How's that for blessing for you? Your son will be a wild donkey of a man. Yes, great. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. He will be contentious. He'll start fights. He'll be obnoxious. He'll be as stubborn as a donkey and just as friendly. This is going to be one winner of a kid. And he shall dwell over against all of his kinmen. He will always be at odds. There will always be contention. There will always be enmity between his brethren. That almost sounds familiar. There will always be enmity between you and the chosen seed. Does that sound sounds almost reminiscent of something else I've heard before, doesn't it? Verse 13, so she called the name of the Lord who spoke there to her, you are a God of seeing, or the God who sees me. For she said, truly here I have seen him who looks after me. Therefore the well was called Beer-lahai-roi, it means the God who sees. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. And Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abraham. So we see a true love story going on here. Abram and Hagar, kind of a story that makes you go, I'm not so sure about this. And sometimes I ask myself, what do you think of Abram's decision in this situation, or the whole idea? Was Abram having faith in God's covenant at this point? Now think this through here for a minute before we just knee-jerk answer here. Was Abram having faith in God's covenant at this point? Who did God tell Abraham that his son would come through? Told him it would come through. Who was it? Sarah. When did he tell him that? Not yet. At this point, as far as we know, God had not yet said who the son will come through. So Abraham sees this opportunity. Apparently in this day, this is not entirely uncommon. Remember, Jacob and his wives kind of had the same thing. Wife number one says, I'm not having enough kids, so here, take my handmaid and have some kids with her, and so they'll kind of be like mine too, because I own her. not entirely uncommon. Also, what I don't see in this story is anywhere where God's saying, you have not had faith in my covenant. We never really see a reprimand. So I'm not saying that this was a good idea. This is kind of a gritty, uncomfortable story. It makes me really uncomfortable to read it. And at the same time, putting myself in Abraham's place, I'm 86 years old. God hasn't given me any details other than you will have a son. Here's the opportunity. It's normal for the culture of the day. I'm not sure. So I'll let you make up your own mind about that. But we don't see any reprimand from God. We see reprimand from Sarai, in this situation, but not from God. But what we do find out from the pronouncement that God gives her in verses 11 and 12, probably this is not the son of the covenant after all. Wild donkey of a man against all your brothers, enmity constantly and fighting. It doesn't sound like the kind of promise that God has given to Abraham that he'll pass on to his son. So probably this is not the love story that we first hoped it would be. We have to wait for something else. Well, we kind of refine things more in chapter 17. Verse 1, when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between me and you and multiply you greatly. Then Abram fell down on his face. God said to him, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of instead of say a great nation, he also says what? A multitude of nations. The verbiage has changed just a fuzz. I mean, not that he's changing the terms and conditions. I mean, he'll still be father, but instead of father of one nation, now he's the father of a multitude of nations. How does this happen? Because now he has, or will have at least a couple sons that will become great nations, won't they? Yeah, so instead of just what we now know will be Isaac, now he has Ishmael and Isaac. Both will become nations themselves. In fact, Ishmael kind of splits into a number of nations. And so he says, you will be father of a number of nations, especially after this whole fiasco with Hagar, that I make my covenant between me and you and multiply you greatly. Then Abram fell on his face, and God said to him, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name will now be called Abraham. So we have a name change going on. Abram means apparently exalted father. And I don't know, I guess you could make the argument that initially God's covenant was to make him the father of a great nation, and after the Ishmael fiasco, now it becomes a multitude of nations, maybe. You can debate back and forth whether or not that's a good thing or not. But he changes his name from Abram, exalted father, to Abraham, which is the father of many. And unfortunately, half of that many, or several of that many, becomes kind of a thorn in the side of his chosen son, doesn't it? They're always fighting. They're always in conflict. And in fact, the people these days, the descendants of Ishmael, are the people who are the what? The Arab nations, who just so happen to be constantly attacking the nation of Israel. How does God's promise play out? Has he been a wild donkey of a man, a little out of control, always contemptuous and fighting, and there's always a tension there? Yeah, I would certainly say so. Just in my own imagination, what would have happened had Hagar and Abram not ever had that kid? Would human history have been smoother? I mean, it's hard to say. Playing if games is a dangerous situation because you never really know. But the descendants of Ishmael have proven to be a lot of problems for the nation of Israel and continue to be so to this day. In fact, they fire hundreds of rockets at them whenever they have a chance. Yeah, and try to kill as many as they can. There's always contention. There's always fighting because of this war. Both descendants of Abraham, God blessed both. They turned them both into nations, but now those two nations are fighting against each other. Continue on. You're the father of many nations now, whether for good or not. For I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. Verse 6, I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make unto you nations, and kings shall come from you, plural. And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you through their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your offspring after you. And I will give to you and your offspring after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. And God said to Abraham, verse 9, as for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you throughout the generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep. Actually, you know what? Let's read that later. Let's skip down to verse 15. I almost forgot my notes here. Skip down to verse 15. He continues, and also God said to Abram, as for Sarai, I just changed your name now from Abram to Abraham. As for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. And I have a footnote here that Sarah means princess. She kind of seems like she acts like a little princess, doesn't she? A little bit. Anyway, I rabbit trail. I diverge again. I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son, not by Hagar, but by her. I will bless her, and she shall become nations. Kings and people shall come from her. Then Abram fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? And shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? So Abram becomes Abraham. Sarai becomes the princess. Yeah. And continuing on, Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son. You shall call his name Isaac. Isaac means he laughs or laughter. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him. As for Ishmael, I have heard you, and behold, I have blessed him, and I will make him fruitful and multiply him greatly. And he shall father 12 princes, and I will make him into a great nation. But I will establish my covenant with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this time next year. So now we know, and God has refined his covenant a little bit more. We know that the son of choice is not Ishmael. It's when Abram and Sarai, or Abraham and Sarah, take your choice, get together, and they produce a son named Isaac. He laughs, or laughter. And that's the result of the covenant. So we see not only is the covenant through Abram's offspring, and now specifically comes through one offspring in particular, and that is Isaac. And the other sons will become contentious and fight against the chosen seed, just like God promised back in the garden. Well, there is one little passage that we skipped here in verse 9. And after we got done with the name thing, I wanted to go back and pick that up, because that has some significance as well. Skip back to chapter 17, verse 9. And God said to Abram, as for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. He who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised. Every male throughout your generations, whether born in your house or bought with your money, from any foreigner who is not your offspring, both he who is born in your house and he who is bought with your money shall surely be circumcised. You, your actual kids, your grandkids, your grand-grandkids, your slave males will be circumcised. Everybody in your family and under your ownership will be circumcised as a covenant between us. So shall my covenant be in your flesh, an everlasting covenant. Any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. And God gives Abram this sign, as physical sign of submission to the covenant. And by becoming circumcised, they're saying, yes, I acknowledge God's covenant with us, and here is a sign that I subscribe to and submit to the covenant that God has given us. And it is this circumcision. So circumcision is given. It's a physical demonstration of belief in God's promises to Abraham and an outward identification with the God of the covenant. And so if you ever wonder why later on in Scripture you always see circumcision being such an important thing, you see why, besides being kind of painful and not all that fun, why is this such an important deal for all the Jewish people? This is why. If they don't, according to God's command here, if they don't submit to this, they're in a sense, in effect, rebelling against God's covenant, saying, God, I don't want a part of you. I don't want to be under your covenant. I want to be totally dissociated with you, and I'm going to separate myself from your people, and I'm no longer one of yours. That's what they're saying by no circumcision. And so if you remember the story when the Israelites crossed the Jordan River into the land to take over the land of Canaan, the first thing, we'll cover this later, sorry to ruin the surprise, the first thing they do after they cross the river into enemy territory, do you remember what they do? God says, wait a minute, we have a problem. You guys, after wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, you haven't been circumcised. How can I support you if you haven't even if you haven't even adhered to my covenant with you. So they stop in enemy territory, vulnerable by all the Canaanites. They stop and they circumcise themselves, which pretty much takes them out of fighting condition for a week or two, make them totally vulnerable. But they did that to resubscribe to God's covenant. And you remember later on in the New Testament where Paul and the apostles, they're arguing back and forth. What about circumcision? Do the Gentiles who are now accepted by God, they should be circumcised too, right? Because circumcision is a sign of submission to God and his covenant and his provision for us. But they come back and they say what? Not really critical for the Gentiles, because that was God's covenant with Abraham, not with the Gentile people. The Gentile people have a different type of, it's a different covenant. It's a different relationship than what the Jewish people have with God. The Gentile people aren't under that covenant, and they don't need the circumcision. The Jewish people, those are subscribing to Abraham's covenant, and they need to be circumcised. Everybody good? Okay. 4 minutes. Yes. Okay. Well, verse, how do we want to do this? Verse 18 kind of talks about God comes back and he visits Abraham and Sarah, and I won't read all this to you, again, time thing. God comes back again, the form of these guys, and they sit by the tent. God says, next year Sarah will have a kid, and Sarah is listening behind the tent door, isn't she? And she says, I'm so old, how could I ever have a kid? I'm like 99 years old now. I haven't been able to have a kid for a long time. That ship has sailed, that time is over, it's not going to work anymore. And she's kind of laughing, and God says, you back there, Sarah, I see. What's so funny? And Sarah says, I didn't laugh. And God says, yeah, I think you did laugh. And so they eventually, of course, have a name, and God had told them what to name the kid. The kid's name would be Isaac, which means he laughs, yeah. Laugh with joy, or laughter because of happiness, but also, unfortunately, it also turns into laughing at God's covenant. So God says, you laughed at me, didn't you? You Isaac'd at me, didn't you? I didn't Isaac. I didn't Isaac at you. Oh, yes, you Isaac'd at me. I heard you. So now, next year, this time, you're going to have a son, and your son's name is going to be Isaac, because you Isaac'd at me right now when I told you. When I gave you my promise, Abraham believes me, but you Isaac'd at me, and so you're going to have a kid. His name is going to be Isaac. And when you say, hey, Isaac, come here, it's time for supper, every time you call his name, you can remember how you Isaac'd at my promise to you, Sarah. But they continue, and as they walk down the road, God says, should I show Abraham what I'm about to do? And apparently talking to probably the three parts of the Trinity, some people say. I would probably subscribe to that. But they're walking down the road with Abraham, and they say, should we tell Abraham what we're about to do? Yeah, I think we should. And they say, Sodom and Gomorrah down there, we're going to blow it up because they are so wicked. Their wickedness has reached my attention. I cannot tolerate them any longer. Chapter 18, verse 22. So the men turned from there, and they went toward Sodom, but Abram stood still before the Lord. Then Abraham drew near and said, but will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? He knew Lot was down there. I think he's probably trying to protect his family, but he's appealing not just to save Lot because it's my family. He's appealing to something very different. Verse 23, will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you sweep away the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous who are in it? Verse 25, far be it from you to do such a thing, to put the righteous to death with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. Far be that from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? He looks at God and says, God, I have a question of your justice here. Would you be willing to punish the righteous in order to punish the wicked? Or will you be willing to spare the wicked for the sake of the righteous? How just are you? Will you punish the righteous as if they were wicked? Or can you separate them? Or do you love mercy, or do you love justice and punishment more? If it comes to a choice, God, would you rather pardon the wicked for the sake of the righteous, or punish the righteous for the sake of the wicked? Did you see what he's asking there? He's appealing to God's justice. God, what kind of a justice are you? What kind of a God are you? which is really the question we're supposed to be asking anytime we read the Scriptures. But he asked that for us. And you know the rest of the story. He kind of bargains down. God says, okay, if I find 50, I will pardon all the wicked people for the sake of the righteous, because I am a God who loves mercy. I am a God who loves forgiveness. And even though the wicked deserve their punishment, and they will get it someday ultimately, but even right now, I will spare all those wicked for only 50. Well, how about 40? Well, how about 30? How about 10? They go all the way down to 10. God finally says, all right, even for just 10 people, I will pardon, at least temporarily, all the wicked people for the sake of those 10 righteous, because that's the kind of God I am. I love mercy. I love forgiveness. I love forgiveness and restoration, and so I will do it. You know the story, of course, and that leads us into chapter 19. Just because it shows up later, I want to read the very uncomfortable story of chapter 19. We don't have time this morning. That's where we'll pick it up next week. 19 turns its attention from Abraham down to the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. But chapter 18, shall I hide from Abraham, seeing that Abraham, this is verse 18 of chapter 18, shall surely become a great nation, all the nations there shall be blessed by him. Verse 19, for I have chosen him that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has promised him. I have designated Abraham and his offspring, his lineage, to follow me, so that I may bring to fruition the covenant that I have given. Not only to Abraham, but as you know from the slideshow, all the way back to Eve in the garden. He's the one I've chosen to fulfill my covenant through. But as always, anytime we outline the one side, especially in Genesis, God always then turns his attention to the other side, doesn't it? And that other side here, he segues through the rest of chapter 18 and that debate back and forth. And in 19, we get a full picture of what the other side looks like, the side where Lot lives. But we'll cover that next week. Let's pray. Dear God, we thank you for this morning again for showing us who you are through the stories that you give in Genesis. They're not just fantastical stories that are entertaining, although they are, but they are there to show us who you are, who your character is, what kind of God you are, how faithful, how covenant-keeping, how concerned you are, how gracious, how merciful, but at the same time just and righteous as well. So many things we can learn by seeing how you interact with your people here and how you respond to all the different situations. Help us to learn from this and get a better grasp of who you are and what you plan for us. In Jesus' name I pray, amen.